Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Well, we were just talking a little bit of just like kind of what the surrounding parts of recovery are defined as.
Yeah, and I think the differentiation between what recovery is versus the other concepts that you hear people talk about, whether it's sobriety or getting healthy, and they all fall under kind of the same umbrella. But I've always looked at recovery as that there's a lot of benefits to recovery. And I think sometimes people look at these things of trying to minimize consequences or take the things in their life that aren't good and try to change those things that are maybe unhealthy or they're getting in their way or creating problems for them, and trying to put things in place to stop doing those things, which I think is a really good place to start. Then I think from a long-term perspective and from a lasting perspective, that helping people understand really what recovery is and why there's a lot of benefits to that are true benefits, not just the absence of consequences.
Yeah. Well, and I think about recovery kind of in the basic level of like recovery from an injury, recovery from a surgery, recovery from a divorce, recovery from depression, recovery from a breakup. I mean, there's so many different elements that we go through. And you and I specifically work with a lot of people that are kind of working through the beginning stages of recovery from alcohol, drugs, sex, gambling. But I think kind of in general, the idea of and the concepts around what are the important things that somebody needs that we could help somebody through in recovery in general, I think apply to a lot of the different things.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons I like the word recovery is because, that's indicating that you don't have to create something that isn't there. And I think what you see is that a lot of times when people are getting into other behaviors or thought patterns, then we start to lose some of those things, some of the good qualities that you just naturally have as a human being. I think a big one that you can talk about is like honesty. Throughout life, most young kids are pretty honest. And as we go throughout life, the honesty and the transparency sometimes begins to get minimized. And sometimes that's because you are hiding some behaviors that you don't want people to know. And that's where it usually starts. If somebody's drinking or using drugs, they will begin by being dishonest about their use. But then that starts to bleed into other areas of their lives and they start to get comfortable with being dishonest. And so I think that obviously I'm somewhat probably lean on the optimist side, but I believe that at the core, that all of us want to be honest and have a more of a tendency to be honest or dishonest. And some of these things that we go through in our lives or things that we're doing or decisions we're making lead us down a path where that dishonesty comes in. And so recovering, when you talk about recovery, it's not necessarily that you need to learn how to be honest. It's more about recovering that part of you that understands the importance of that and why that matters for how we live our lives.
Yeah. Well, and a concept that you brought up to me a bunch of years ago that I bring up a lot in therapy is that we have a public life, a private life, and a secret life.
Mhm.
And if you were to kind of ask anybody kind of what they keep in their secret life, most of it is things that they're really ashamed about or embarrassed about. And that's a lot of the work that we do in counseling and that I do is really help people develop a different relationship with the things that they feel the worst about, whether it's lying or a relapse or other things that are associated with being a bad person or doing something really bad. And I think that's a really difficult cycle because when we hold on to the feelings of feeling like we are a bad person because we've done certain things or because we are keeping these secrets, they tend to lead to other behaviors that, again, just pile on and make us feel even worse.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that you see that gets broken down the most when people are in these situations where they have, like as you said, that they've done things that they don't feel good about or have shame and guilt around, is, to me, that kind of erodes their, you can use a lot of different words, but self-esteem or self-worth, and I know they've all got different definitions, but really just about at the core of how we feel about ourselves. And I think one of the things that can be confusing for people is that they may still be confident, they may still know that there's certain things that they're great at, but at the same time, there's this underlying erosion of kind of how they feel about themselves. And I kind of always look at that aspect of it is that's about feeling good about ourselves, and confidence, or kind of the upper levels are about feeling great about ourselves. And I think you can feel great about yourselves in certain aspects of your life, but you still may have this underlying kind of erosion of self-esteem. And so it's really hard for us to get to where we want to be when you have, I look at those things as like an anchor kind of pulling you down. And so it's really hard to live the life you want to live if the underlying feeling is that you're doing a lot of things that you're ashamed or embarrassed or feel guilty about. It's hard to get to the places. And so some of that is kind of identifying what those things are that lead to that. And again, maybe it's drinking or drugs or gambling or whatever it is that we really don't feel good about ourselves. And then kind of trying to work on building up that self esteem or self worth so that they feel not only like they're great at certain things, but they're good just overall as a person.
Yeah. And one of the things that comes up for me when you talk about that is the idea of should. Like, I have a great job, so I should feel better, or I'm married, so I should feel more grateful. I hear that a lot, that I'm X number of months or years sober, so I should. And again, I just think that that's such a big part of how we're trying to recover is it's not just creating abstinence in our life, but it's really figuring out how to develop a deeper and closer relationship with who we are and who we've been, and try to really align ourselves with an approach of self love and grace for what we've gone through to really help change the way that we see ourselves.
Yeah, that reminds me of a story that I think I've told you before, but throughout my life, I've met a lot of really interesting people. And during a time in my life years ago, I had befriended a homeless guy and kind of really got to know him well and had some really interesting conversations with him. And he was a really positive guy. And he didn't kind of on paper, didn't have much to be positive about, but he was amazingly positive. And I would say that he felt good about himself. At the same time, I had another friend of mine who had kind of on paper everything. He had been very successful in business and had a lot of money. His wife was fantastic. He had two really great kids, all the things you think of like that were nice about his life, but he was not very positive. And I would see this contrast in these two people, and I was seeing them both kind of regularly. And in my mind one day, I was really kind of interested in this and wanted to explore it a little bit. And so I asked the homeless guy, I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, if 10 is you've got the greatest life of all, and 1 is life is terrible, what is it? He thought about it for a minute and he looked at me and he said, an 8. And the next time I saw my other buddy who had on paper seemed like everything was great, but seemed to always be talking about the things that he didn't have, I asked him the same question and he thought about it and said, a 7. So from the outside, or like I said, on paper, that wouldn't be the answer you expected. But when I'm telling that story, the question I always ask myself, which I'll ask you as well, is who would you rather be?
Right. Would you rather be an 8 or a 7, with all of the different kind of things that somebody may have or not have?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you started off around honesty, right? As one of those principles or one of the things that are part of recovery. And I think a second thing that comes up a lot for me is not living in the past or the future, just living in the moment. That you have what you have, you are where you are. And the better that we're at, the better I'm at just being right here, that I really have enough and I'm typically in a pretty good place. And whether we call that mindfulness or living in the moment, being present, that's definitely, if you ask a lot of people, like, hey, right now, in this very moment, is everything okay? Most people would say yes. It's really just if they reflect back, well, I didn't get that thing, or that thing in the future I'm not gonna get, or this thing's not gonna work out. That's really when we find the most amount of emotional disturbance.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that people who have had certain disruptions in their life, of whether, some of the things we've talked about, but I think that they spend inordinate amount of time either in the past or the future. Sometimes it's more so one than the other. So one of the things when I'm working with somebody in early recovery that may have had, substance abuse or whatever, I asked them, I said, is there anything in the last 24 hours that you feel really bad about, that you feel a lot of shame and they will think about it and they'll say no. And then I'll say, is there anything in the next 24 hours that you're really worried about? And they will think about it and say no. And I would say, well, how great would it be if our brains only lived in that 48-hour rolling calendar? And then I try to help them learn how to do that. And this is something that was really important in my own recovery, is that people had helped me understand that. And even to this day, and I think for some people this is hard and who are close to me, but I really only live in about a 5-day span. I don't spend much time in the past. I don't spend a lot of time in the future. And I think that gives me a lot of peace. Now, when it comes to planning things and things like that, then you have to think about the future. But I look at that more as being in action. And if there's something that I need to do for the future, then I'm taking care of that, which to me really means I'm still living in the present because I'm doing something now to try to make an outcome that I would be happy with. But I'm not necessarily looking at all the potential outcomes.
You're not living there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not
Yeah.
living in that moment. Yeah, and that's a hard practice. I remember when we went to team retreat to a wellness studio and we all practiced some meditation. We all talked afterwards about how hard it is to keep our focus in the present moment. And the facilitator even acknowledged that in the beginning. And they were like, look, every 7 to 10 seconds, you're going to drift off of the moment. So we're kind of wired that way. And so, yeah, it takes practice for us to keep reminding ourselves that peace. And, we started with the word recovery, that, to feel like we're in good recovery really requires us to practice and bring our focus and awareness to the right now.
Yeah, and I think part of that is I think throughout our lives, we've been taught that worrying means you care. And if you're not worrying about something, then that must mean that you don't care about that. And, personally, I look at worrying as one of the most worthless emotions we have. I don't think it's very helpful, but I think our brain tricks us into thinking that by worrying about something, we're actually doing something. It means I care. And for the most part, there's a quote about worrying that I really like that is, and I'm going to butcher it and get it wrong, but this will be close, is that worrying is making up stories about the future with undesirable outcomes for ourselves.
Well, and isn't that so true that normally when we think about something in the future, it's not, we're going to get it, it's going to be awesome, and it's going to work out just the way we want it. It's normally the opposite, right? It's not going to be great. It's not going to go the way that we want it to. That perspective affects our present moments. If we're thinking that we're not going to have the things that we want to have, or it's not going to go that we want it to go, then we're almost living in that disappointment and loss in the moment.
Absolutely. And I think if we started off talking about recovery, but we've spent very little time talking about the actual things that you're recovering from. And I think that some of these kind of deeper concepts or other ideas, all of these things that we've talked about are really kind of core essentials of what recovery is. And if you can learn to kind of do some of these things and embrace some of these things, then I think overall you feel better about the way you're living your life, whether it's honesty or whether it's worrying less or whether it's, we touched upon the two people that I knew with the life being an 8 or a 7, which I think really encompasses gratitude and, kind of being able to work on some of those things. To me, those are the benefits of recovery. And none of them have to do, I think we have to learn how to change behaviors that get us there in the first place. But the bonus, the thing that really allows people to have long lasting recovery are not the lack of the things we feel bad about, but it's a combination of kind of finding the things that we don't feel good about and trying to limit those and minimize those, and then finding the things that we feel good about and trying to maximize those and really have those be a much bigger part of our life.
Yeah. And I was talking to someone recently, that if you ate 4,000 calories of sugar, your body would feel pretty bad. And the same is true with our mind and our body. If we feed ourselves kind of the negative messages, whether it's past shame or things related to things that happen in addictive kind of patterns or behaviors, then we're feeding ourselves that version of it and we're not feeling great.
Yeah, and I think one of the confusing things is that the way a lot of those behaviors start is that they do provide some benefit. You're looking to feel different, whether it's you want to have more fun or you not want to think about something that's bothering you or you're stressed out and you want to worry less. And I think where it gets confusing to people is that when a lot of those behaviors start, it actually works for the reason why they're doing it. And as that increases and gets to be a bigger part of their life and being the solution to more things, then that's where you start to see people get in trouble and these things start to really negatively impacting their lives because that solution becomes the only solution for all of their things. I remember in my past, I used to think of alcohol as fuel for anything, right? If I needed to put some work in, if I was going to go meet somebody, whatever it was. And, there was a time in my life when I really believed in that. And in the younger years, maybe that worked a little bit, but pretty quickly it was no longer really solving those things. But I had come up with that as the solution to many things.
I'm glad we talked about this morning. It's helping me remember to be grateful and to just be in this moment.
Yeah, gratitude's a big concept. And I think in the future, we'll talk again about that one in particular, because I think it's a really, really important part of recovery.
Agreed.